Aaditya was just a 12-year-old boy when the world around him crumbled into shadows and silence. After the mysterious death of his mother in a horrific car crash near an ancient cursed well in their remote Uttar Pradesh village called Nagpur. But the strangeness wasn't in her death, it was in her disappearance. Her body had vanished from the crushed car and was found 3 days later near the edge of the well. Her head bent, soaked in mud, her hands folded strangely as if pointing to something deeper than death itself. And though the village women whispered of cursed waters and spirits that lived beneath, Aaditya's father dismissed it all as superstition, arranged her cremation swiftly, and tried to bury both body and memory. But that night, when the family gathered for the 13th day ritual, Aaditya sat alone in his room, staring at his mother's framed photograph. And as the wind blew the dye out and the shadows came alive, a distinct silhouette, his mother's, appeared on the wall and whispered in a voice that sounded both loving and broken, "Have you forgotten the promise, my son?" And before he could even scream, the door refused to open. The room turned colder than the wind outside, and when light returned, everything was back to normal except for Aaditya's heart, which now carried a seed of fear that only grew stronger each night at exactly 12:01 a.m. when the same diya extinguished itself and the wall behind him bore her shadow again, sometimes weeping, sometimes pointing, sometimes with outstretched arms as if begging to be heard. And all this reminded him of the last real conversation he had with his mother: "If I ever leave, don't go near that cursed well. There's no God down there, only betrayal. And if you ever see my shadow, don't run, just listen." And so one night, determined not to live in fear anymore, Aaditya sat silently in the dark, waiting for 12:01, and as expected, the wind came, the light died, and his mother's shadow reappeared, not speaking this time, but pointing slowly toward the well. And Aaditya understood, grabbed a torch, her old red chunri, tied a rope to his waist, and made his way toward the forbidden well, where strange chills ran down his spine and even the moon seemed afraid to shine. But his resolve was stronger than fear. So he climbed down into the mouth of the well, where every few feet a new whisper called out to him, a baby's cry, woman's scream, a heavy breath, and as he reached the bottom, he found something chilling. His mother's bangles, buried in layers of bones and ashes, even though he had placed them with her at the cremation. And before he could understand, a burnt face emerged from the shadow, part of her skull exposed, eyes hollow, and her voice, now hoarse and angry, spat, "Your mother disrupted the silence of the well. Now you must wear the chain." And suddenly a necklace made of broken bones twisted itself around Aditya's neck, burning his skin and binding his spirit to the cries buried deep within that cursed place, where every wronged soul, every betrayed woman, every silenced scream from generations past waited for justice. And as he tried to climb out, the rope broke, but the spirits lifted him gently, whispering, "You are our voice now." And by dawn, when the villagers came looking for him, the well was empty, but on its wall, written in blood-red script, were the words, "I am not Aaditya anymore. I am the voice of their silence." And from that day, no one ever dared to go near the well again. Yet every new moon night, a soft lullaby could be heard across Malpura, one that mothers never taught, one that daughters never sang, but one that chilled even the most hardened souls. "Beta, don't break your promise, or your shadow too will return." And though the villagers tried to forget, and Aaditya's father was taken away in handcuffs for his confessed crime, having pushed his wife to the well for knowing its truth, something darker had begun to take root. Because while Aaditya's mother's shadow had now vanished, others had awakened, and Aaditya, now older, carried the voices of every silenced woman etched into his breath, and began to visit village after village, exposing hidden wells, haunted corners, and places where history had been soaked in blood but never remembered, speaking on behalf of those who had no tongue left, those whose stories were locked in walls. And people started calling him the Shadow Seer, because every place he went, shadows spoke, truths rose, and the wind always whispered the same word before the screams, Ma. And thus, the boy who once feared a shadow became the man who gave shadows a voice. And perhaps, even in death, his mother never left him but became the reason he lived. And so, Aaditya, now no longer just a boy but a vessel for the forgotten, wandered village to village under different moons and fading suns, listening to walls, shadows, wells, and even cracks in the earth that whispered centuries of untold grief. And in his journey, he started carrying an old leather-bound diary, where he drew the shadows he saw and wrote the names of those spirits who came to him, names never heard, women never mourned, daughters never searched for. And each time he uncovered another cursed ground, he lit a diya and spoke aloud their story, And slowly a strange phenomenon began. People from nearby towns started whispering his name in fear and hope. Shadow Seer, the one who could hear the silence beneath screams. And one day, an old woman from a village named Unwari approached him and said, "There is one well deeper than all, where even death doesn't echo, where not just women, but entire families vanished. And that's where your shadow will find its truth." And intrigued, Aaditya reached Unwari under the cover of night, and the village felt unlike any other. It was quiet, but not peaceful, like a place that had decided long ago never to cry again. And as he stepped inside the village boundary, he heard nothing, not dogs barking, not crickets chirping, not even the sound of his own breath, just silence as heavy as mud. And then, without being shown the way, his feet moved on their own to a mound in the middle of a forest grove, where a half-buried stone marked a dried well covered in thick vines. And the moment he touched the vines, a scream escaped the ground, splitting the silence like glass, and shadows burst out, not just one or two, but dozens, hundreds, women of all ages, some holding dead infants, some dragging burnt limbs, others without faces, each of them howling in different tones, yet saying the same words: "He killed us." He buried the truth, and then cursed the land to forget. And Aaditya fell to his knees as their emotions flooded through him, a tsunami of betrayal, anguish, and injustice, showing him visions of a zemindar from 1870s who had created a secret ritual of sacrifice, offering women to the well, believing their souls would keep his dynasty alive. And when they tried to rebel, he killed not just them, but their entire bloodlines, and every descendant was erased from records. And that well wasn't cursed, it was fed by rage, its silence protected by the fear of being forgotten. And Aaditya realized he had to break the ritual, but the moment he tried to light a daya near the well, the shadows screamed, "You cannot light light where our stories were buried alive." And Aaditya's hands turned to ash for a moment before reforming with black veins across his palms, as if the darkness had accepted him now as one of their own. And just then, the forest around the well began to twist, the trees bled sap, the ground cracked, and a stone idol rose from beneath, not of a god, but of a woman with eyes stitched shut and mouth sealed in gold. And the spirits whispered, "She was the first ... the mother of all injustice, and only her story can end ours." And Aaditya realized this was bigger than his mother, bigger than his own pain. It was the genesis of silence itself, and he had to go beyond shadows now, into what the spirits called the hollow, a space between life and death, where stories never born live and rot, and rituals never ended still breathed. And to enter he had to give up his voice, for only voiceless truth could enter the hollow. And so Aaditya took a vow of silence, bound his mouth with his mother's red shnri, and plunged into the dried well, which now opened like a jaw, swallowing him whole. And what lay beneath was not darkness, it was memory itself, raw, jagged, and screaming, where time was not linear and space bled colors that didn't exist. And here Aaditya was shown not just the stories of murdered women, but of men who watched and stayed silent, of children who grew up learning to ignore screams, of gods who turned their eyes away, and most painfully he saw the truth of his mother, that she too had known this darkness, had tried to expose it once, but his father had silenced her. And the reason she became a shadow was not because she was killed, but because she had died unheard. And Aaditya broke the vow silently, letting the agony inside him surge through his throat like fire. And he screamed not in fear, but as a declaration, "Your stories will be heard." And that scream shattered the hollow, freeing countless untold spirits who now rushed upward like a storm of liberation, bursting through every cursed well. In India, every wall where blood was hidden, every house where mothers still cried at night alone. And Aaditya emerged from the well, changed. His skin now bore the marks of every spirit he had freed, and his eyes no longer blinked, for they had seen beyond light, and wherever